Welcome to Leading Questions. I'm Megan Ma.
And I'm Julia Sydorenko, and we're lawyers at Weirfolds. For those of you who aren't familiar with Leading Questions, during each episode, we answer some of your questions about law, business development, and professional development. Thanks for joining us for another special student edition for all you students who are participating in law firm recruitment. We know that virtual in-firm interviews are around the corner, and so we're hoping to answer some of your burning questions about what to expect in the virtual interview process.
While our earlier episodes focused on tips for preparing for virtual interviews, today we want to focus on tips for the virtual interview itself and tips for after your interviews. We're joined by two of our 2021 summer students who just recently went through the same virtual interview process this past spring, Gavin Fior and Amir Sodagar. Thanks so much for joining us, you guys.
Thank you for having us.
All right, we're going to kick it off with Amir. Amir, could you give us your top tip for your interviewing?
Yeah, so my top tip would be to pay very close attention to the questions being asked and make sure above all you answer that question fully and succinctly. I think it's then important to provide a strong and relevant anecdote or example to support your answer. Not only does this solidify your response, but it also gives the interviewers insight into some of your unique experiences and shows that you have relevant or transferable skills that'll help kickstart your legal career. So that would probably be my top tip.
That's a good one. And on that point, could you give us a little bit more insight into what kinds of questions our future interviewees can expect?
Yeah, so I encountered a lot of behavioral questions. For instance, what are some of your strongest weaknesses and how do you overcome those weaknesses? I definitely encountered a lot of those types of questions across all firms I was interviewing with.
That's a good point. You want to prepare for all sorts of questions, behavioral, and know your resume inside out. So thank you for that. I'm going to throw over the same question to Gavin. Gavin, could you give us your top tip about interviewing?
No, absolutely. So my top tip for in-firms is actually a recycled tip that I was given when I was preparing. And that's to always keep in mind that law is a client-facing service profession. And by this, I mean, try to round out your answers by connecting them to skills that are traditionally associated with really good client service. So things like time management, organization, interpersonal skills, all those should be at the forefront of your mind and should be what you ultimately connect your answers to. And secondly, and actually very important, is the energy levels that you have during your interview and that you're able to keep them up for the entirety of your interview. It is virtual, so this is really the only way that they get a sense of your presence and personality. So keeping the atmosphere high or the energy levels high and your interviewers engaged is really important in the virtual atmosphere.
I agree. I think showing your most authentic self is extremely important, especially in a virtual setting. I know it's hard, but it's definitely a great tip. And on that note, could you also talk a little bit more about balancing the interview with your interviewer?
Absolutely. So especially over Zoom, it's really important to maintain a sort of healthy dialogue between you as the interviewee and the interviewer, which means, like Amir mentioned, making sure that your answers are succinct and clear, but also giving your interviewer time to ask follow-up questions or to finish their question in entirety. They seem like little things, but they're actually really important, and you should be cognizant of them during the interview itself.
That's right. I think it's important to ensure that you're not creating a monologue, but you're also not giving one-word answers during your interview. Thank you for that.
Yeah, such an important point to read the virtual room. And also, I like your point about keeping that energy up. And we all know from the OCI process, it's such a long day. You know, it's also a long day for your interviewers. So keeping that energy up is so important throughout the day. Gavin, coming back to you, can you share some of the tips that you have for the post-interview process? So some of us want to know about those thank you emails and the virtual networking events at the end of the day. Any tips for those?
Yeah, absolutely. So on a practical note, it's really important. Firms may come back to you and ask whether you have interest in meeting anyone in particular at the firm, or your interest in a certain practice area and would like to meet people that are involved in that practice area. So preparing in advance people that you might want to meet or practice areas that you do have interest in is really important, because then you can answer those questions and look prepared, but also gain more insight into the firm. So being prepared in that regard is incredibly important. And then for the social, quote unquote socials that occur after or can occur after your interview, I would be prepared to talk about things that are outside of your resume or on your resume, but in the extracurricular section. This is because they've probably gotten everything that they wanted out of the generic resume and behavioral questions, and they're going to want to know more about you as a person. So be prepared to talk about what you have on your resume in extracurriculars and also experiences outside of that.
Thanks so much, Gavin. What about you, Amir? Anything to add to those tips for the post-interview process? Anything about thank you emails? Anything about those networking events at the end of the day?
Yeah, so I think after you've completed your interview, you should draft an email to your interviewers, thanking them for their time and reiterating your interest in the position. If you wanted to meet somebody, reiterate that. If you wanted to learn more about a practice group, express your interest in that. And try to make these thank you emails personable. Don't make them boilerplate or generic. So if you spoke about something in particular with an interviewer, highlight that. Say, it was a pleasure meeting you. I particularly enjoyed our discussion on, the firm's commitment in its equality, diversity, and inclusivity initiatives.
Those are great tips. And anything about kind of scheduling those next day interviews? So you've made it through day one, you've made it through day two. Sometimes you do get those emails asking you to schedule kind of follow-up interviews or follow-up meetings the next day. Any tips in terms of scheduling?
Yeah, so the firms that I'm really interested in, I would schedule them to be the first firms I interview with. So I would try to schedule them for the morning. I'd also try to give myself a buffer just in case an interview goes over the planned allocated time. For instance, 20 minutes may turn into 40 minutes. That gives you enough leeway to make it to your second interview without telling your first interviewer that you have another interview upcoming and you have to cut the interview short, which could show a disinterest in the firm.
That's such a great point. I think in this virtual environment, it's so hard, or it can feel so hard sometimes to have those touch points and to figure out how do I show interest to these firms. But that's a really great way of doing it. And even just the way that you schedule those follow-up meetings, the second or third day, can really show to a firm that you're one of my top choices and I am really interested in you. And on the firm side, they'll be doing the same. So thank you so much to both of you, Gavin and Amir, for joining us today. We hope that these tips are helpful for those of you out there with upcoming virtual interviews.
And thank you all for tuning in. If you have any questions or topics that you would like us to address in future episodes, please email us at leadingquestions@weirfolds.com. All the best in the interview process, and see you next time.